On November 20th, 2018, the quiet town of Ocean Township, New Jersey, was shattered by an unimaginable tragedy. A fire raged through the Caneiro family's home, leaving destruction in its wake. But what seemed like a terrible accident would soon reveal itself to be something much more sinister. Inside the house, the bodies of Paul Caneiro's brother, Keith, his wife Jennifer, and their 2 young children were discovered, all murdered before the fire ever started. As the investigation unfolded, authorities realized this was no simple accident. This was cold, calculated murder. At first, no one suspected Paul Caneiro. He seemed like the grieving brother. But as the details emerged, one chilling fact became clear. The fire was just the beginning of a much darker tale of betrayal, greed, and murder. To the outside world, the Caneiro family was the epitome of success. Their lives seemed like a perfect postcard of the American dream. 2 brothers working side by side, a thriving business, beautiful homes and families that were loved by their community. Paul Caneiro, the older brother, had built a reputation for himself in the business world, a man who had his life together, it seemed. His younger brother, Keith, followed in his footsteps, joining him in running a successful business empire. Together, they were more than just family, they were partners. But beneath the surface of their seemingly perfect lives, a storm was quietly building. While Paul and Keith appeared to be on the fast track to success, their financial situation told a very different story. The brothers' shared business had experienced unexpected setbacks. Their once profitable ventures were slipping into financial disarray, and the cracks in their empire were beginning to widen. Paul, in particular, was feeling the weight of his struggles. His lifestyle, once funded by prosperity, now seemed dangerously unsustainable. The debts were mounting, and the pressure was unbearable. Paul's efforts to mask the financial strain were starting to show cracks in his personal life. Friends and colleagues began to notice subtle changes in his demeanor. The charming, confident businessman now seemed tense, distracted. At home, he spent more time alone, retreating into his own thoughts, his mind racing with worries. Keith, too, was becoming increasingly aware of the pressures they faced. Though they tried to shield their families from the growing storm, the tension was undeniable. On the surface, the Caneiro family continued their routine, seemingly untouched by the storm brewing underneath. But the reality was far from perfect. For Paul, the pressure to keep up appearances became unbearable. The debts, the business failures, and the mounting stress were pushing him toward a dangerous breaking point. And when you combine the strain of financial ruin with the sense of powerlessness, something shifts in the human mind. The story of the Caneiro family wasn't going to end with a tidy resolution. No, it was about to take a terrifying turn, one that no one could have predicted. But it wasn't just the weight of financial ruin that was slowly consuming Paul Caneiro. A deeper, darker force was at play. The very family that had once been his foundation, the people he loved most, now seemed like obstacles to his escape. His brother Keith, who had worked beside him all these years, was now seen through a different lens, a symbol of everything Paul felt he had to lose. And in that moment of desperation, when everything seemed out of reach, a twisted thought began to take shape. As the days passed, the gap between their public lives and private reality grew ever wider. The Caneiro family, once a symbol of success, was about to become the epicenter of a tragedy that would forever change their lives. And the man at the heart of it all, the very one who had built it all, he was about to destroy everything in a desperate bid to salvage his future. November 20, 2018, the day that would change everything. As the sun began to rise, so did the flames that consumed the Caneiro family home. At first it seemed like any other fire, a tragic accident that might have been sparked by faulty wiring or an unfortunate mishap. But as the fire raged on, with no sign of stopping, suspicions began to mount. Paul Caneiro's house, the very home that was supposed to be his sanctuary, was burning to the ground. And inside, the bodies of his brother, Keith, his wife, Jennifer, and their 2 children were discovered. At first, investigators suspected the fire might have been accidental, maybe a malfunctioning appliance or a tragic misstep. But as they sifted through the ashes, it quickly became clear that something much more sinister had occurred. The bodies of Keith, Jennifer, and the children were discovered inside the house. All of them lifeless before the flames even had a chance to do their damage. And the most chilling detail, the fire itself seemed too perfect, too precise, as if it had been set deliberately, not by the unpredictable nature of an accident, but by someone who knew exactly what they were doing. But the most shocking discovery came next. Despite the devastation of the fire, there were signs that the fire itself wasn't the cause of death. Keith, Jennifer, and the children had been killed before the flames ever touched them. Their bodies showed signs of blunt force trauma cruelly taken from this world before the fire had even begun. This wasn't just a fire. It was a cover-up, a murder masked as an accident. The investigation was rapidly shifting gears. What had been perceived as a tragic, unforeseen loss was now a deliberate, calculated act of murder. Detectives began to dig deeper into Paul Caneiro's life, the man who had seemed the most devastated by his family's loss. At first, it seemed like a reasonable reaction. After all, Paul was a grieving brother. But as the investigation progressed, something didn't quite add up. Paul had been out of the house when the fire began, and there were conflicting reports about his whereabouts. But more importantly, the police couldn't ignore the mounting evidence that pointed toward one horrifying possibility: Paul Caneiro may have been involved in the deaths of his own family. And then the ultimate betrayal was revealed. Paul Caneiro had been hiding something much darker than anyone could have imagined. The financial troubles that had once seemed like small cracks in the surface were now revealed to be a massive, catastrophic fault line running through his life. Paul was deep in debt, his business failing, and he was under immense pressure. But perhaps most terrifying of all, Paul stood to gain millions from the death of his family, money he desperately needed to cover up his mounting debts and restore his crumbling empire. As the investigation continued, the pieces began to fall into place. The fire, the deaths, the financial motive, it was all too clear. And soon the question was no longer whether or not Paul Caneiro had committed this horrific act, but why? What had driven a man to destroy everything he loved, to kill his own flesh and blood in cold blood? The Caneiro family tragedy was no longer a mystery, it was a disturbing testament to the lengths some will go to protect their own skin. At first, investigators were left scratching their heads. What could have led to such a violent, calculated act? Was this simply an unforeseen tragedy, or was there something far darker lurking beneath the surface? As the investigation progressed, a disturbing pattern began to emerge. Financial troubles, family tension, and betrayal, the very things that had seemed so distant, now seemed at the heart of the mystery. How had Paul Caneiro, once a well-respected businessman, gone from being a grieving brother to the prime suspect in his family's brutal deaths? The deeper investigators dug, the clearer it became. Paul Caneiro's family wasn't just facing financial hardship, they were facing something much more sinister. Bills were piling up, loans were overdue, and the once thriving business was crumbling. But was this the only factor at play? What lengths would Paul go to in order to protect his crumbling empire? Could the financial strain really be enough to push someone to murder his own family? As the investigation continued, investigators soon realized there was more to Paul Caneiro's life than just financial struggles. It wasn't just the bills and the stress of mounting debt. No, it was the strain on his relationships, the growing tension with his brother Keith, and the unsettling reports from friends and neighbors. Was the pressure of keeping up appearances starting to crack? Or was there something more personal between Paul and Keith, something that had been festering for a long time? But something still didn't add up. How did Paul, who seemed so devastated by the loss of his family, also have the means to benefit from their deaths? Investigators began to connect the dots, finding evidence of a large life insurance policy that Paul had taken out just months before the fire. Was this a tragic accident? Or was Paul Caneiro orchestrating a plot to collect millions from his family's deaths? As the case deepened, the question on everyone's mind became unavoidable. Could Paul Caneiro have taken the lives of his family for the sake of money? The insurance payout wasn't just a financial lifeline, it was his ticket out of the debt that had been suffocating him. But was that enough to push him to murder? Or was there something more at play, something darker lurking beneath the surface? As investigators pushed forward, they discovered one final chilling fact: Paul Caneiro's desperate financial situation was not an isolated problem. It was the culmination of months of lies, deceit, and misdirection. Paul had been hiding his true financial condition from those closest to him, and in doing so, he had created the perfect storm. But could any amount of financial strain truly justify what happened that fateful night? What would drive a man to kill not just his brother and his family, but his own future as well? Paul Caneiro wasn't just a businessman, he was a man with a history. A history filled with financial instability, mounting debts, and secrets that he desperately tried to keep hidden. On the surface, he appeared to be a successful entrepreneur, a man who had it all. But the deeper investigators dug, the more they uncovered a man trapped in a web of lies, struggling to maintain the image of success while facing ruin behind closed doors. Was his financial collapse the true motive behind the brutal murders? Or were there darker forces at play, forces far more personal, perhaps even rooted in his own past? As investigators delved into Paul's past, they found that the financial troubles weren't just recent, they were years in the making. His business, once a thriving enterprise, had suffered significant losses due to poor investments, bad partnerships, and mounting debt. But what made Paul's situation even more dire was his inability to ask for help. He isolated himself, hiding his failure behind a mask of success. Was this the tipping point? Was the weight of his financial ruin enough to push Paul to kill? Or had something deeper been festering inside him all along? The financial collapse was not Paul's only struggle, though. His personal life began to suffer as well. The pressure of maintaining appearances took its toll on his relationships. His wife, his children, and even his brother Keith, whom he had once trusted and worked alongside, everyone noticed the change. But were these outward signs of strain enough to explain the horrific murders? Could Paul's downward spiral have turned into something far more dangerous? But it wasn't just financial troubles that kept Paul awake at night. As the investigation unfolded, a disturbing pattern of lies and deceit emerged. Paul Caneiro had been living a double life, hiding his financial ruin from everyone, his family, his friends, and even his closest business partners. Was this life of secrets and deception the real cause behind the murders? Or was there more to Paul's past that had been buried for years, waiting for the right moment to resurface? Could it be that Paul Caneiro's need to maintain his image of success was more than just vanity? Was it this need, this obsession, that ultimately pushed him toward the unthinkable? The evidence continues to suggest that Paul's downward spiral was fueled by his inability to face his failures. But did his fear of losing it all truly justify the murder of his own family? Or was there something more, and even deeper, more personal reason behind his violent actions? The investigation had uncovered more than just financial ruin. It had peeled back the layers of a man torn apart by fear, lies, and a need to control his fate. But the question remained, was this a man pushed to the edge by circumstance? Or had something darker, more sinister, been lurking within him all along? As the investigation progressed, it became clear that Paul Caneiro wasn't just trying to escape his financial ruin. There was something darker at play, a motive rooted in desperation, but also in something more sinister. It was not just money Paul sought. No, Paul Caneiro was willing to do whatever it took to conceal his actions, including committing the ultimate betrayal, murdering his own family. The evidence pointed to a carefully orchestrated plan, one designed to wipe out his loved ones and erase all traces of his involvement. But how had everything come together so perfectly? And what pushed him to such an extreme? Was it simply the pressure of financial collapse? Or was there something deeper, something more chilling driving him? The details were chilling. Paul Caneiro had set fire to his own home, but not as a result of a random act of desperation. No, he had carefully orchestrated it. The fire was his attempt to destroy everything, the evidence, the bodies, and any trace of his involvement. He knew that if he set the right fire, if he could destroy the home and leave nothing behind, no one would suspect him. But how did he think he could get away with it? What led him to believe that this catastrophic act would secure his future and escape from his tangled web of lies? As investigators pieced together the evidence, it became clear that Paul had set the fire deliberately, using gasoline to ensure that the flames spread quickly and consumed everything in sight. It was calculated, methodical. But the question still remained, was this act of arson truly the culmination of financial desperation, or was there something more personal at play? Could it be that Paul's need to control the situation had overtaken him, driving him to commit a crime that would destroy his family in more ways than one? The more Paul's story unraveled, the clearer it became. He wasn't just trying to escape his financial ruin. He was trying to cover up his role in the murders. The fire was his ultimate attempt to erase all evidence and redirect suspicion. But did Paul truly believe he could get away with it? What did he think would happen once the fire had destroyed everything? And could he live with the truth of what he had done? In the end, the pieces fell into place. Paul Caneiro had meticulously planned the murders and the fire that would follow. The motive was clear: money, control, and the desperate need to escape a life he could no longer maintain. But as the investigation continued, one question lingered. Was Paul simply a man driven by financial ruin, or was there something deeper, something darker lurking inside him? What ultimately had pushed him to commit such a heinous act against the very people he was supposed to love? It wasn't long before the evidence piled up, and the authorities had no choice but to take action. Paul Caneiro was arrested, and his case quickly became the subject of media frenzy. The prosecution laid out their case. Paul had orchestrated a massacre to cover up his financial collapse, a crime driven by desperation and greed. But as the trial began, a critical question lingered. Was Paul truly the mastermind behind the horrific events, or was there someone else, someone who had been pulling the strings all along? The prosecution wasted no time in presenting their case. They outlined the details of the crime. Paul Caneiro, desperate to escape his financial ruin, had planned and executed the murders of his own family, hoping to cover his tracks by destroying the evidence in the fire. The fire, they claimed, was meant to erase the brutal reality of the deaths, to create the illusion of an accident, and leave Paul free to claim the life insurance payout that would rescue him from financial collapse. But despite the overwhelming evidence, a sense of doubt still lingered. Could Paul really have carried out such a heinous crime all on his own? Was there more to the story? As the defense prepared their case, they introduced a new angle. Paul Caneiro was a man under extreme pressure. He had lost everything: his business, his reputation, and now his family. Could such a man, desperate to escape ruin, have acted out of pure desperation? Or was someone else involved in this twisted plan? But the question remained, was Paul truly the mastermind behind the killings? Or was he merely a pawn in a larger, more complex web of betrayal? The defense attempted to shift the narrative, painting Paul as a victim of his circumstances, overwhelmed, mentally exhausted, and unable to cope with the pressure of his failing business. But the prosecution wasn't ready to let Paul off the hook so easily. As the trial progressed, Paul's defense crumbled under the weight of the evidence. With each passing day, the prosecution's case became more airtight, leaving less and less room for doubt. The financial motive, the calculated nature of the fire, and the chilling indifference in Paul's demeanor all pointed toward one conclusion: Paul Caneiro was the architect of this horrific crime. And then, after days of deliberation, the jury reached their verdict. Paul Caneiro was found guilty of 4 counts of murder. The community was left in shock, unable to comprehend how a man could destroy his own family in such a cold, calculated way. But the true question remained: why did Paul do it? Was he simply overwhelmed by his circumstances? Or was there something more at play, something darker, something that had been building for years? The Caneiro family tragedy left the community in shock. For those who knew the family, the events were impossible to fathom. How could something so horrific happen within the walls of a home that had once been full of love? Paul Caneiro's actions shattered not only his family but an entire community. The loss was felt far beyond his immediate relatives. As the trial concluded, the questions only grew: could this tragedy have been prevented? What was the tipping point for Paul? What kind of darkness had driven him to destroy the ones he loved? For those closest to Paul, the fallout was especially profound. Family members, once supportive, were left grappling with the revelation of his monstrous actions. How do you reconcile the person you thought you knew with the brutal reality of what he had done? And how do you live with the guilt of not seeing the signs before it was too late? In the end, the true cost of greed, betrayal, and desperation became undeniable. Paul Caneiro's actions didn't just destroy his family, they shattered the illusion of a perfect life, the one he had so carefully constructed. For a man desperate to escape his failures, the toll was far higher than he could have ever imagined. And as we reflect on the Caneiro case, one unsettling question remains: how far would you go to protect yourself? To save your own skin? And when is it too late to turn back? Don't forget to like, subscribe for more interest episodes. Thanks very much for watching today's episode. See you in my next story.